This video is a continuation of my previous two videos talking about the idea that nuclear weapons are a fiction invented by the government. And so far we've looked at a fake test bombing video from the 1950s and also the original Trinity test of the atomic bomb, which again was a ridiculous pile of nonsense. The concept of the nuclear bomb was introduced in a sci-fi book called The World Set 3, written in 1913, published in 1914 by H.G. Wells. He predicted that scientists would one day understand how to tap into the internal energy of atoms, and they would achieve this around the year 1933, which at that time was in the future. This would be then used to make a super bomb, an atomic bomb. Wells presented this as a positive step for mankind. Wells was a globalist politically. He in the book, the idea was that by the government having an atomic super bomb, there would be an end to global warfare, and instead there would lead to an era where a single scientific one-world government of an educated elite would run everything, would control everything for the good of mankind. No one would be able to stand in their way because they possessed this, fearsome new weapon. So the book covers a fictional future timeline where peace is achieved by a global government using this atomic weaponry. You wouldn't want to fight in the future because warfare would be too destructive. So it's interesting that the atomic bombs are originally a globalist concept, which was predicted to come about in the early to mid-30s. Now, what's fascinating to me is that then this kind of happened. So the book was notably read by scientist Leo Szilard, who conceived of a nuclear chain reaction in 1933, and then suggested that nuclear fission could be a thing. So, firing loose neutrons at an object, hoping to knock its neutrons loose so they can hit more neutrons in turn and then cause a chain reaction that releases energy. He thought that this could be a self-perpetuating process and could lead to nuclear reactors, so he patented nuclear reactors in 1934. He happened to be mates with Albert Einstein because the pair of them had worked on designing a fridge together. No, really. And so he got his friend Einstein to write a letter to the president saying, hey, watch out, President, the Germans could make an atomic fission bomb, and that would be terrible. So, you should give us money and then we'll make you this bomb. That's part of how this came to be. So then this led to the Manhattan Project. So the thing is, it's very different having a weaponized form of fission that explodes and destroys buildings and people. That's a very different prospect to having a fission reaction that can be used in a reactor. Essentially you just need it to be able to boil water to create steam. Is a very different prospect. So I want to get into that a bit. For starters, there's a lot of different things to cover here. If the initial reaction is explosive with the material you're using as the fissile material, then you're going to blow apart the material you need to sit there and endure the chain reaction. So what you end up with is you need a very fast reaction to release all the energy, so neutrons hitting other neutrons loose, before the material of the bomb explodes prematurely in a fizzle, a minor explosion that scatters a couple kilograms of metal over a small area with minimal effect. It can't be too slow or it fizzles, it can't be too fast or it explodes, it has to be just right. Normally in a fission reaction, like in a reactor, you normally need what's called a moderator. So the moderator is some sort of medium, like a vat of heavy water or graphite rods. From like the TV show Chernobyl, they had those graphite rods that failed. That's the reason they have this stuff is a moderator to slow down the fission reaction. So the free neutrons released at fission are too fast. They can't fission another atom. A free neutron causes fission with an atom in a power plant after being moderated or slowed down. So you can't slow down the free neutrons in an atomic bomb. They don't have a moderator. They try and get around this by saying there's a reflector that bounces the neutrons back to increase the odds of hitting more atoms to cause fission. But this is not the same thing, and they don't have that. They don't do this with reactors. It's a completely different design. So the difference between slow reaction fission in a reactor and fast fission reactions in what they suggest could happen in a bomb. So then we get the weird aspect as well of keeping the material subcritical until it goes critical. So until you have the explosion, the idea is you have to keep the fissile material subcritical. You don't want it exploding until you're ready. This is achieved by keeping 61 kilograms of uranium metal, so solid metal, in separate pieces, each below the critical size. If you have them separated, then there's no destructive reaction. To produce the destructive reaction, to produce the critical state, the pieces of metal uranium are brought together rapidly to become critical. Then there's this flash, then there's a release of energy, a vaporization, a death of the people around it. But it's just such a ludicrous idea. I mean, imagine having two solid bits of metal, banging them together, and then they explode. It doesn't. That's not something that happens normally in physics. Bringing two separate subcritical pieces of uranium or plutonium, solid metal, in contact with each other does not produce one solid piece. So the idea you bring the pieces together to make them denser atomically doesn't work. If you smack two rocks together, they don't fuse and become one rock. Same with metal, it doesn't happen like that. Nor if I smack two bits of metal together does the thing become more atomically dense. But that's the whole idea of why you suddenly bring these components together to go from being a subcritical weight to a critical weight. And again, that magic 61 kilograms or up number for that to happen. It gets even weirder if you look on things like Wikipedia, that the critical mass can be affected by the shape as well. So if you put it in a sphere, it's suddenly denser. So, okay. It's still the same material. Why not a cube? Why not a rectangle? Why not a triangle? So two small metal pieces can't become one by compressing them together. It doesn't work like that. The design of the gun-type bomb is strange as well, because if you look at the schematics for the implosion style bomb, the idea is that they have it in this sphere and they put the explosives around it, and the compression shockwave compresses the metal, makes it denser, makes it go critical, gives a smaller space in which the neutrons can hit the other neutrons free. But in the gun-type bomb, you're not having a spherical explosion. You're having an explosion at one end. The detonation knocks the one piece of subcritical uranium down the pipe to hit the other chunk at the other end, which then sets it off. But of course, again, you're not having it contained there. The shockwave isn't contained. It's going one direction down the cylinder of the bomb. So again, there's a release of energy that's lopsided. So it's not a symmetrical compression. It's coming at it from one angle. Apparently, this doesn't impact the ability for the bomb to explode. So it's a completely different design. Somehow this also works. It's interesting to me that both the Germans and the Japanese investigated the idea of a nuclear bomb. Both governments separately abandoned it as unworkable. They didn't have so much of a problem with reactors, that was one thing, but for there to be a fission bomb that explodes, that was abandoned as not practical, not working. They try and say that the reason the Germans couldn't figure it out was because they were such awful anti-Semites. They got rid of all the best scientists. So you see, because the Americans had lots of Jewish scientists working on it, like Szilard, like Oppenheimer, then it meant that they could have the edge, whereas those silly Germans without the Jews helping them couldn't figure it out. I'm not quite sure how that works with the Japanese, but there we go. There's lots of other issues as well, like just two quick ones would be the temperature changes that occurred from taking the bomb to a high altitude in a hot climate and then dropping it and it rapidly descending. That could easily affect the components of the metal, because the idea is you've got the masculine and feminine aspects of the internal critical fissile material need to slot together, and if they're slightly a different size because of cooling or heating, then it's not going to fuse together and detonate. Another issue would be that there are free neutrons flying around the atmosphere anyway, more so at higher altitudes. So when you take a bomb that doesn't appear to have any shielding from outside neutrons, then by taking it up in a plane, there's no real explanation for why the bomb wouldn't just detonate in flight. So that's something that doesn't make much sense. There's a great bit on the Wikipedia page about Little Boy you can read, where it says that after the war ended, it was not expected that the inefficient Little Boy design would ever again be required, and they destroyed the plans and diagrams for it. So this is extraordinary as an admission. They'd spent billions on the research of the nuclear bomb, the Manhattan Project. This was a huge amount of their research and development. They only worked on the implosion bomb in the last year or so of the project. So they took Little Boy, the plans for it, and they got rid of it. This is very strange, very unusual, and they then compound this by saying that because a few years later they had to then start using gun-type bombs again because of issues with plutonium becoming scarce, they then had to essentially reinvent the little boy design from scratch. So there's multiple issues with the gun-type fission bomb concept, as I say. There's issues with the background of the bomb being envisioned, this theoretical concept with lots of money being spent in multiple countries trying to actualise the idea. You get to late 1944 and the Manhattan Project team basically throw out the gun-type bomb to invent the implosion bomb. They do Trinity, which is demonstrably falsified, as I've shown, and post-war testing being fake as well. So why fake it? Well, it goes back to the world set free, the idea of a weapon that prevents your enemy trying to attack you, a weapon that you win by default by simply possessing. So much money spent, nothing achieved. They had to get something out of the project. So the big shots get together and say, let's say we have the atomic bomb. They know the war is wrapping up. They know the Axis power is going to lose by this point. So the final step is to put on a big performance to show the world that this super weapon exists. That's why you have Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to be the dramatic scene that emotionally impacts everyone and makes you a believer. You may not know that Japan was completely smashed by the USA by 1945. There's a lot of emphasis placed on soldiers fighting on tropical islands in the Pacific and how the Japanese infantry were these vicious zealots who would fight to the last man. But this overlooks what was going on the mainland. The US Air Force had air superiority over the Japanese. They could fly their bombers over any Japanese city and smash it without retaliation. Heavy bombardment was going on from the middle of 1944. And it says here that Japan's military and civil defences were unable to stop the Allied attacks. The number of fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft guns assigned for defensive duties in the High Islands was inadequate. Most of these guns had difficulty reaching the altitude at which the B-29 bombers operated. There was fuel shortages, inadequate pilot training, lack of coordination within units. So the US was able to basically strike with impunity from the air, preferring night attacks with firebombing. So there's a lot of firebombing going on in Japan. Now, if we look at the bombing of Tokyo, this was achieved in early March of 1945. This is an incredibly destructive bombing raid of the capital. They destroyed 16 square miles or 10,000 acres of the capital city. They killed about 100,000 people. They left about 1 million people homeless. And again, they did this with the B-29s. They did it with fire bombardment because a lot of the Japanese architecture was, wood, those paper walls and things. It wasn't very resistant to fire. It was built for earthquake defense and to be light, but it was not good against fire bombardment. So it didn't take long for the Americans to work this out. And they then were using things, for example, like napalm was massively increased in production. They had millions of pounds, literally tons of napalm in cluster bombs and incendiary bombs, and they used this for the fire bombardment raids. So you can see here that after the main raids were finished for Tokyo, they destroyed just over 50% of the city. So 50% of the capital for the Japanese was incinerated. They then went on to continue bombing all the other major cities, and then they proceeded to attack smaller cities as well. So they were able to, because of their technological superiority, the Americans were basically able to bomb the length and breadth of the country, small cities, large cities, small towns, residential areas, military factories, ports, whatever they wanted, and they were able to do it in a way where the Japanese basically couldn't even shoot back because of the altitude their planes were flying at. So there's some pictures here. This is a part of Shizuoka after it was firebombed in June. This is part of Sendai that was raided in July. This is a street view of Okayama in August of 1945. Here's a aerial photo of Toyama after it was being burnt on the 1st of August. So they just had absolute devastation all over Japan. There was nothing the Japanese could do to prevent this. And when you're able to do, logically now, if you think about it, if you're able to do this to your enemy, you've already won. You can't incinerate half of someone's capital city and just flatten any town or village you wish and say that they're some kind of threat. Clearly in retrospect, this must be seen as a ludicrous flexing of military muscle, total overkill. The Japanese obviously were trying to surrender at this point. That's not talked about much. The Japanese did not want to continue to fight the Americans because the Japanese were being incinerated every single night. But the Americans kept bombing. They really wanted to burn people, so they kept at it. And this is obviously justified with this rationale that the Japanese were this impossible, mystical, subhuman yellow devil that was, responsible for Pearl Harbor, and therefore those lads from America could fly out there and do whatever they wanted. So it's interesting looking at these photos, just how much damage the Americans were causing, and how the impact of the firebombing looks when we're going to compare that to the photos of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in a minute. The other thing to bear in mind is you then have the issue of the Virgin Cities problem. So what do I mean by that? Well, this is where, with all the widespread bombing and the fact that the atomic bomb program was secret for obvious reasons, though it wasn't like the Manhattan Project scientists were able to talk to the US Air Force and say, hey, don't bomb these cities. Just leave Hiroshima, leave Nagasaki in an untouched state, keep them pristine, because we want to be able to test the impact of our bomb down the line. They couldn't do that. So the logical reading of history is that since we know that the US were firebombing cities the length and breadth of Japan for months unimpeded, Hiroshima and Nagasaki would also have been firebombed for months unimpeded. So the cities weren't heavily populated at the time. Lots of people had been evacuated anyway, and God only knows what level of firepower had been levelled at them already. I mean, just look at Dresden, for example, of what they were able to do with fire bombardment. So they try and argue that Hiroshima was not a target, so it was left untouched or something. Hiroshima was a city with 318,000 people to begin with. It was a major quartermaster depot and as a port of embarkation for the Japanese. So in addition to large military supply depots and ordnance manufacture, it also produced things like large guns, tanks, machine tools, aircraft and ordnance parts. So it was clearly a valid target if Bomber Command were prepared to bomb these other places that could be quite residential. They definitely have a reason to bomb Hiroshima. It's also common knowledge that central Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was largely wooden or paper one-story houses with simple rooms. It was only a very small number of places but were concrete buildings, and it wasn't particularly resistant to fire protection. So anyway, there's a lot of faff about how the targets were chosen and a lot of guff about how they couldn't do any demonstration bombing or drop leaflets or things because people would suspect them of trickery, or the Japanese might somehow magically be able to shoot down the bomb in the air with its non-existent air force. And then eventually we get to the flight of the Enola Gay, the B-29 bomber that carried the Little Boy bomb, along with several other aircraft that were there for weather reconnaissance, blast measurement, instrumentation checking, and photography. Indeed, they had a whole plane, the Necessary Evil, flying purely to photograph what happened. So they take off. They get to Hiroshima about 8:15 local time, August 6th, 1945. This is just a few weeks after the Trinities occurred, and they drop the bomb. It's an aerial explosion. They're flying at about 31,000 feet, so it falls to about 1,900 feet, so 580 meters above the city, and then that's when it detonates in midair. They say that the weapon was inefficient. Only 1.7% of the fissile mass actually fissioned properly. So apparently this really was sufficient to release 16 kilotons of TNT as an explosive force, giving you a 1 mile or 1.6 kilometer radius of total destruction, with resulting firestorm beyond that for another 4.4 square miles, or about 11 kilometers squared. So they drop this bomb. People on the ground refer to it as the Picadon. So the Pica, brilliant flash of light, and the Don is a booming sound. So this is the flash and the bang, And then we get this photo, which shows allegedly shows the atom bomb cloud 2 to 5 minutes after detonation. I would argue that this might not actually be anything more than clouds. It might be a very small scale smoke cloud, possibly. It does beg the question with the idea of a mushroom cloud as well. There's an issue here with, if you have a fission bomb, there's nothing burning. You have fire from the buildings catching on fire because of the heat wave and whatnot, but the actual bomb itself is a release of atomic energy. There's no chemical reaction. There's no fuel being consumed, so there's no reason for there to be a mushroom cloud in the first place. If it's detonated on the ground, you might kick up some dust and dirt, but as we'll see in a minute, there is no crater underneath where the bomb went off. So the Enola Gay flies home, and everyone slaps themselves on the back, and then it's in the newspapers and the cover of Time magazine, and we hear about how, oh my god, this is such a big deal. What we're going to look at now is more information from the actual ground itself, from Hiroshima. We're going to look at before and after photos of the city and some interesting aspects of this. So for that, so we can go into more detail, I will see you in part 2.